Hi, I'm Lucy Churchill. I'm the sculptor who reconstructed the portrait medal of Anne Boleyn, known as the Most Happy. It's a particularly interesting historical artefact because it is the only surviving contemporary portrait, the only undisputed contemporary portrait of Anne Boleyn that we have in existence. The commemorative portrait medal was never issued. It exists as a single lead prototype in the British Museum. It seems that the project was scrapped in the autumn of 1534 when Anne's pregnancy just stopped being talked about. It seems that she had a miscarriage and no more was mentioned. And so this commemorative medal shows Anne before that time, before things started to go wrong for her, when she was at the height of her success and when she truly was the most happy. The portrait medal has been damaged at some point in its history. Quite likely it was soon after her death, when Henry VIII wanted all mention of her to be eradicated. And it seems clear to me that something heavy has been put on the coin. Initially I thought that this was careless storage, but now I realise that it could equally well have been somebody trying to hide it and safeguard it. But unfortunately the higher points of the face have been flattened and it looks rather disfiguring. But luckily the damage is actually rather superficial. So when I examined it under magnification at the British Museum, there was still a whole wealth of detail that existed in the lower parts of her face and which could easily be joined together in order to put together the face as it would have been, the face and the elements of her dress. If your first impression of Anne Boleyn was based on seeing some of the paintings that were made long after her death, or if you saw television or film adaptations where she's always shown as a very beautiful woman, it can be quite a disappointment to see the real face of Anne based on this contemporary portrait medal. To be honest, she doesn't look like a beauty. Her face is long, her chin is heavy, she has a strong, determined set to her mouth, and her eyes look rather heavy-lidded, possibly rather bulbous. But all these things are actually in accordance to contemporary accounts of how Anne Boleyn looked. Even her most fervent admirer admitted that she wasn't a great beauty, she wasn't the most beautiful woman at court, but it was the way she behaved that she was able to fascinate people and draw people to her. It's funny to think that the Most Happy medal is actually one of the least known portraits of Anne, even though it is the most authentic. Eric Ives said that the Most Happy medal could only have been made by royal authority. So what we have is really the best account of what Anne Boleyn looked like and also how she wanted to be seen in 1534. So not only does it give us an image of her physical features, but it also gives us a great representation of her character, because she would have been quite specific about the details of it in order to convey the message that she wanted to put out in this commemorative medal. So the question is, why was the medal made? Initially, in the Victorian times, when the medal first came to the British Museum, it was suggested that it was made to celebrate her coronation. But that happened a year previously, in 1533. Later on, more recently, it was suggested that it was to celebrate her second pregnancy, because we know that she was pregnant in 1534. But I think to look at it as a mere celebration trinket is to look at it with contemporary eyes, as if it was a little gift that one might issue at a baby shower. And I think that Anne was actually using it as a piece of strategic political propaganda, and I shall tell you why. But before I talk more about the medal, I just want to make a little detour and talk about the choir screen in King's College Chapel, which was also commissioned by Anne Boleyn during the same period. And after I made my initial reconstruction of the medal, I then turned my attention to the choir screen and made a detailed study of the iconography across the choir screen. It is encrusted with carving, and each and every element, I believe, is of significance. Studying the choir screen certainly deepened my appreciation of Anne Boleyn's ability to convey a potent political message without using words, and often using beautiful decorative imagery. The choir screen for a long time was considered also to be a celebration piece, believed to celebrate the marriage of Henry and Anne. And it does celebrate their marriage. It's covered in images of fecundity and has many examples of their initials combined. But I think the key to the choir screen is one particular very disturbing image which is placed in a really prominent position just to the right of the arch leading to the altar. So you cannot reach the altar unless you go past this, and it's in a very prominent position, so you can't fail to see it. And what it is a head, a dismembered head that's pulled aloft by its hair, long strands of hair, and the head is screaming in agony, and it's a very disturbing image. I believe that this head screaming in agony represents Absalom, who was King David's son. And during the 1530s, Henry was becoming increasingly reliant on King David as an example and justification for his split with the Church of Rome. And contemporary viewers would have understood this biblical image, and they would have seen Absalom as being an example of a rebellious son who came to a sticky end. And this example wasn't just an empty threat, because at this time the oath of supremacy was being issued, and people who refused to swear it were actually being put to death, such as Archbishop Fisher and Thomas More. And the oath was all about rearranging the succession, so Catholic Mary would no longer inherit the right to the throne, and instead any issue of Anne Boleyn's would be put in her place. So, having decoded the iconography on the King's College Chapel choir screen, I was left with a much deeper understanding of Anne's use of visual imagery, and so I returned to the medal and looked at it with fresh eyes and asked, what was Anne trying to say? Because I knew that she never lost an opportunity to make a political punch at the same time as making something very beautiful. So in looking at the elements of the medal, an obvious starting place is the gable hood, but I'm going to come back to that. And I'll just first talk about her stance, which is very strong and distinctive. It's the arms akimbo pose that Henry later actually became very famous for. And nowadays it's often used by Donald Trump and Boris Johnson and also Wonder Woman. And it's a very bold position. It takes up space. It looks very rooted. It seems to say, I'm here, I'm not going away. It's interesting to compare the portrait of Jane Seymour when she's wearing the same gable hood as Anne is wearing in the Most Happy Medal. And it's interesting to compare the two, because Anne is in a very different pose to Jane Seymour, whereas Jane Seymour has her hands meekly in front of her body. And you can just basically get quite a sense of their two different characters merely from their body stance. in the way they wanted to be depicted. The other thing about Anne's stance is by standing like this, she's drawing attention to her breasts. And in the medal, they really seem quite emphasised, which of course, if she was pregnant, which she was in 1534, her breasts would have been enlarged. And I think that she's drawing attention to them, not just to celebrate her fecundity, but to emphasise the fact that she is in a pregnant state in 1534 and that she is wearing the Queen's gable hood while she's pregnant. I think that's a very significant part of the medal. I've often heard people say, that can't be Anne Boleyn, she's wearing a gable hood. Anne Boleyn wore a French hood. And she did wear a French hood, but she also wore gable hoods. We have records showing that she owned both in the royal wardrobe. And when it matters, Anne chose to wear a gable hood. We know that she wore one on the day of her execution, and here in this commemorative medal, she chose to wear an English gable hood. And it's not just any gable hood. Having studied it at close hand and having recognised the details of the billament, the pattern of the jewels, and even the weave of the fabric, I was able to recognise that the same hood was being worn by Jane in the portrait by Holbein, and after that I worked backwards and found it also in paintings of Catherine of Aragon. And it's very easy to see, with looking back, to see Henry's wives all as a group, as if they come in a boxed set. But in 1534, there weren't the other wives. It was just a case of Catherine, his wife of 20 years, and Anne Boleyn, this usurper. It was a battle between the two women for the rightful place as Henry's wife and Queen of England. So for Anne to be depicted wearing her rival's clothing was an audacious statement. But it wasn't just the new younger wife wanting to flaunt her success. Catherine was still alive in 1534, and she had many supporters at home and abroad, many very influential power players who were working to restore her to the throne. So for Anne to be depicted wearing clearly this important piece of Queen's clothing, because not only Catherine and Jane, elements of this wardrobe were seen in all the other paintings of Anne's subsequent wives, so it was clearly an incredibly important piece. And so for Anne to be depicted wearing it was a real power move. In Tudor times, royal headwear had enormous significance, symbolic significance that would have spoken to people in a largely pre-literate age. And so when Anne was depicting herself wearing Catherine's gable hood, she was echoing the move of Henry V when he rode off the battlefield at Bosworth wearing what he claimed was the crown of Richard III, which he said had been abandoned in on a thorn bush as Richard fled. And so it really is who wears the hat has the authority. Anne had used this strategy before when she was crowned Queen at Westminster Abbey in 1533. She was 6 months pregnant then, and she had the unprecedented honour of being crowned with the crown of St Edward, which was a hugely symbolic gesture for the kings, usually only reserved for kings. So the fact that Anne was being crowned with it indicates that she was wanting to have her unborn child legitimised with the coronation. It's as if the child was also being conferred legitimacy to the throne with this symbolic crown. Unfortunately, though, that child, as we know, was a girl, and in the 1530s nobody could imagine that any princess could succeed and become queen in her own right, let alone the most important royal England has ever seen. But Elizabeth wasn't just a girl. Her legitimacy was highly questionable because it was very vague as to when Henry and Anne actually did get married, whether or not they were allowed to get married at all. And so it was very important to Henry and Anne, once they decided to make their break with Rome and really go for it and to set up the Church of England, now that Anne was crowned queen and pregnant again, it was crucial that they made a very strong statement establishing the fact that Anne was the true Queen of England, and the true Queen of England at the time of conception of the child that she was carrying. So I believe this is the whole crux of the Most Happy Medal. I think Anne is displaying herself wearing her rival Catherine of Aragon's gable hood, saying, "Check me out, I am the legitimate wife of Henry. I am the Queen of England, and my child will inherit the throne." And I love having this symbol of Anne's boldness as a lovely counterpoint to the rest of her story. I think it's a very precious artifact. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. If you want to read more about my reconstruction and my research, you can find it on lucychurchill.com, and I make copies of the reconstruction which you can buy, both enlarged as a wall plaque and also at the actual size of the real coin. So it's very nice to be able to hold it in your hand as Anne would have been able to do, and also as a pendant, so you can wear Anne close to your heart if you like. Thank you very much.